against China's reclamation activities in the area, because back in 2013, during the meeting in Sunnylands Ranch between Xi Jinping and Obama, there was not much of a discussion apparently on the South China Sea, at least in their formal statements. And I think there's a lot of excitement in the Philippines, particularly among officials, that the United States will finally pierce into the 12 nautical miles territorial sea of China's artificially created islands. I think this is very important because the position of the Philippines is that most of these were low-tide elevations that are extension of the Philippines continental shelf. They cannot be appropriated, and therefore they cannot even generate their own 12 nautical miles territorial sea. So it's very important for the United States to challenge China's sovereignty claims over those artificially created features. I think there's also a lot of sense of urgency in the Philippines over the reclamation activities in the South China Sea. A while ago, Bill was talking about the fact that China has not occupied new features, but the concerns in the Philippines is that the Scarborough Shoal, which was coercively taken away from the Philippines in 2012, China may have plans of also building, facilities there with military purposes. And of course, China's airstrip construction on the Subi Reef and Mischief Reef is also of huge concern, because the Subi Reef is very close to the Pito Island, which the Philippines call Pagasa, and the Philippines has had the airstrip there since 1973. And also China is building an airstrip in the Mischief Reef, which is very close to the Second Thomas Shoal, where the Chinese Coast Guard have placed effectively a siege on Filipino detachment in that area, and also close to the reef bank, which is very important to the Philippines' energy security. And the Philippines has been very desperately trying to exploit hydrocarbon resources there. So there's this huge sense of urgency in the Philippines that there should be a pushback against China's reclamation activities and its posturing in the region. To be honest, I think in the Philippines there's also a lot of frustration with the slowness of the ASEAN's ability to come up with a code of conduct. A lot of us have been proposing that at least Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia should develop a code of conduct first before foisting it upon China or trying to socialize China to sign up to that. For me personally, what is very disconcerting is that while Vietnam and China have developed at least 3 different hotlines, Japan and China have been also engaged in confidence building measures, and as Bonnie Glasser has excellently also covered, the United States and China have also been negotiating queues and other forms of confidence building measures. The Philippines and China have not yet negotiated any significant confidence building measure, or there are no functional hotlines between the two countries. So as the South China Sea becomes more and more congested, the risk for accidental clashes goes higher, and the fact that the Philippines and China do not have any kind of communication channels in terms of confidence building, that is a huge concern for me. And I think what we also have to, in closing remarks, keep in mind is that these reclamation activities in China are overlapping with other clocks. For instance, in terms of the legal arbitration within a month or so, we should know if the arbitration tribunal will exercise jurisdiction on this issue. And of course, with the APEC summit in the Philippines coming soon, we hope that South China Sea issue will also be on the table, but will be discussed in a constructive manner. So I'll just keep it short and sweet, and thank you very much again for the invitation, Governor.
Thank you so much. Let me ask you a question. Why has the ASEAN process been so slow? I mean, there are lots
Right. When it comes to the political security issues, when it comes to political security issues, it's really a unanimity-based decision-making. In terms of economic affairs, I think ASEAN has done better because the decision-making process is the ASEAN minus X formula. But we do not have that in political security matters. So it takes one country, let's say Cambodia or Laos, which are very close to China, to say no, and nothing will really happen. And that's why we're saying at least there should be a code of conduct among ASEAN claimant states like Malaysia, Philippines, Brunei, and Vietnam, before we can pressure and socialize China to signing up to that. This is essentially what we did with the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation before asking US and China and other countries to sign up to that.
Well, it's great to have you with us, and I hope we can welcome you back at other discussions that we do have. But thank you so much for being a part of this. Okay, now I'm going to ask Dick Perzola to join us.
All right, well, thank you, Governor.
One of the originals around here is in front of this.
Yeah, I'm an original. My wife tells me I'm an original.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you for inviting me to speak a little bit. I'm such an august group of China and Asia experts that I said, well, I must be able to contribute something to this conversation. And I said, well, let me take a look at it from strictly a communication, a PR point of view, which is what I do for a living. And the bottom line is China is clearly in violation of UNCLOS. It's been the law of the sea since 1994. It's been recognized by all the participants. And in terms of telling the story, I think we need to include that message in the story. We need to give our message a legal underpinning. And also in terms of awareness, one of the things that I thought was pretty interesting is Tuan asked me to speak a week or so ago, and I said, my God, what am I going to talk about? So, and I started reading news articles, and then the Democratic presidential debate came along, and how many people watched the debate? How many people saw Jim Webb saying, we're all paying all this attention to the Middle East. What about China? What about the South? What about the South China Sea? What about, and that took the awareness level among the American public from here to here. But what else can we do to win the argument and to convey our side of the story? And I think about Frank Luntz, who spends his life coming up with the right words to make his point of view. And he gave us such lovely expressions as job creator and the death tax. And this is a guy who devotes his life to using the words that the words to make the case. And so I started thinking, well, how do we communicate the problems in the South China Sea? And for one thing, the press always says they're the disputed islands. They're the disputed territories. They're Vietnamese territories. They're Vietnamese islands. If that's our argument, then call them Vietnamese islands. Give them Vietnamese names. Argentina didn't fight over the Falklands. Argentina fought over the Malvinas. And when we talk about China expanding reefs and expanding atolls that are underwater, we're almost mitigating what China is doing, which is really blocking channels of navigation. So just because blocking a channel of navigation is attached to something that's under the sea at high tide, you're basically piling rocks where ships need to go. And the other, I'll just conclude with one last point, is when we talk about the runway on one of the Spratly Islands, and whether it's militarized or whether it's not. If we talk about the island and we talk about the runway, say it's long enough to land a B-52. No one knows what the Chinese counterpart is of a B-52, but everybody knows that a B-52, especially people of our age, know that a B-52 has a denotative and a connotative message that means big-time war. So underscore the message with the words that will make our point, and be harsh, be tough, but I think by doing so, we make our point, and it's, anyway, Tuan's looking at me like I should, like I've done my 2 minutes, so thank you.
Well, I suspect part of the problem here is that while the United States, in this particular part of the world, talks a lot about international law, you look at U.S. conduct in the Middle East, I don't see any observance of international law at all. And you've got to be consistent in this business, folks. So I imagine that when we start talking about international law, I suspect our Chinese friends scratch their heads a little bit, since they're not quite sure whether what we're talking about in Asia is what we're talking about in other parts of the world. And I think that compromises our ability to be effective under these circumstances. We'll see. Anyway, we're pleased to have Dr. Lei Wong with us. Welcome from Boston University. And
Thank you so much for inviting me over, and I'll keep it really short. So last time when I was here, I talked about the importance of public opinion in this case. So, you know, the public opinion in different countries and the international public opinion in general will have a significant impact on the decision-making process in the different countries. And I also talk about that in general, the public still follow traditional news media such as newspapers and television news for information and public and viewpoints about important issues like this case. So we went ahead and conduct some analysis on the news coverage and the public opinion about the South China Sea dispute. So at the stage of the media analysis, we picked 3 countries and their respective newspapers. So we picked China, Philippines, and the United States to see how they covered the case. And then the time frame we used is from 2001, January the 1st, to December the 31st, 2014, a total of 4 years. And as for the public opinion, we look at how Twitter users talk about this case. And then from 2001, 2011 to 2014, you can see that there are a total of about 372,000 tweets that talk about the South China Sea. And you can see from this graph that South China Sea dispute triggered a lot more conversation in the year of 2014 compared with the previous years. So we just did took some samples and did some preliminary analysis, and I'm going to show you some results. So we are using network analysis to see on how newspapers cover the interactions between different countries. So in this graph, you can see each node represents a country, like 1 represents China, 2 represents United States, 4 represents Philippines. And in China's coverage, the triangular relationships between China, United States, and the Philippines received the most attention. And there are quite a few articles that talk about interactions between China and Vietnam. And this graph shows you the valence of the relationship. Red represents positive, yellow represents neutral, and blue represents negative. So in China's coverage, there are equivalent amount of coverage, like positive, neutral, and a negative coverage. And actually in China's coverage, China was portrayed as a good neighbor and a country to seek peace, and a country that are willing to talk with the international community. So if you look at the interaction between China and ASEAN, all of those links are positive. And also if we take a look at the attributes of those links, so you see those different lines, like red represents conflicts, pleas, clashes, yellow represents political dialogues, pink represents economic consequences, green refers to a frame of legal framework, black refers to public sentiment, blue refers to historical legacy. Again, as I mentioned earlier, in China's coverage, China is actively working with ASEAN to resolve the issue peacefully, even using this legal framework. And in China's coverage, China criticized the United States for intervening in the issue. And China also criticized those neighboring countries like Vietnam and the Philippines for their provocative actions to cause conflicts. So that's from the China's perspective. So because I don't have a lot of time, so I'll keep the second part short. So actually Philippines and the United States, they use a similar discourse to cover this issue. And we can see that you can see the most of the links in the Philippines coverage were negative. So a majority of the news coverage in Philippines and the United States, they highlighted the conflicts, the clashes of the issue. And they use a lot of strong words to represent China's role. For example, Philippines use like incursions, invasions to portray China's acts. And in the United States, like the New York Times and then the Washington Post, they use words like assertive, threatening, bullying, disturbing to present China's role. And then they use words like flexed, China's flexing its muscle, and also they highlighted China's ambition to pursue the economic resources like oil resources, fishing resources in the area. And they even applied that China is going to take over the world commercially. So from the standpoint of communication, you can see that I will say that the coverage, especially those Western media organizations, they sort of sensationalize the issue, and they also use a very negative tone to portray China, and that may even worsen the situation. And according to our analysis, as for the side of the public, to a large extent, the Twitter conversation followed how the Western media portrayed the issue. And again, you can see that most of the links are negative. And then rather than talking about the diplomatic means, rather than talking about political dialogues and the conversation, the majority of the Twitter users talk about the conflicts, the rising tensions of the issue. So I'll just conclude to say that because of the sensationalizing of the issue of the Western news media, the public also adopt the same discourse to think about the issue, and that's not something that we want to see. So while we are talking about the solutions to resolve the issues peacefully, we also want to take the media's role into consideration. And instead of sensationalizing the issue, a more responsible, objective representation of the issue is something that we want to encourage and call for. Thank you.
Thanks, Clay. We're always looking for responsible journalists, aren't we? Do the right thing, try to report the news accurately and well. I'm not sure we'll ever get there, but people like David continue to set that standard for us. Okay, so we've had lots of good analysis of what's going on there as best we can determine. Now let's turn to the question of how we avoid armed conflicts. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Sean Hansler with us, somebody with a military background, but also now teaching at U.S. Naval War College, and a native of Rhode Island. Welcome. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you, Governor. And I'm glad that we've got, kind of figuring out what the nature of the problem is might be the easy part. So you gave me the, what's the solution? So 7 minutes, I think I can come up with a solution to the problem. But obviously, the speakers that have gone before me have done an outstanding job, really outlining where we are now. And so what I'm going to do is really zip through some slides here, and I apologize, move beyond them to get to the slides I really want to talk about. These are the 4 questions that I want to discuss. I'm really going to linger on the last 2 there. What are China's objectives? And actions do speak louder than words, I would suggest. And I think we need to think through what China's objectives are if we're going to come up with a solution or some type of strategy to deal with that. And so I'll go to what's next. So I'm going to move fairly quickly through slides that discuss things that we've already discussed before and get to this first thing. Now, I teach at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. And everything I say here is my own personal opinion, doesn't reflect the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy. I know you've all heard those disclaimers. But this is where I live, this is who I teach. I teach flag officers and senior officers that go out to our numbered fleets and work at what we call the operational level. And so the way we view the world is, we're the M in the dime film. There's diplomatic, informational, military, economic, financial, intelligence, and legal. Those are the tools at the strategic level in the toolkit to accomplish your objectives. We reside at the operational level. We like to think that we have a phasing construct where we're trying to shape the environment here in the South China Sea so that we don't have to get to a crisis type situation. If we get to deter, then that's what we have to do. We have various theater campaign plans and security plans to try to work with regional partners, and you see us doing that across the Asia Pacific region. Things like trying to get base access, conducting multiple exercises with many of the nations in the region, foreign military sales, at the end of the day trying to increase capability, capacity, and interoperability. With the Chinese in particular, people are not aware, we've had extensive military relationships with them over the past few years, to include the exchange of our senior naval officers here recently. We conducted port visits in each other's nations. We have a Chinese ship coming to Hawaii soon. We've negotiated agreements to eliminate the possibility of miscalculation in the air or at sea, and obviously we're going to conduct fawn ops here in the near future, at least according to the open press. So that's how we view the world. The question for the operational level of war, or operational level, is, so what's the strategy? Anything we do has to nest with the strategic strategy. I'll make a provocative argument here, I think Bonnie touched on it. I'm not so sure we have a strategy, or at least a cohesive, synchronized, integrated strategy. So, again, move forward. Actions speak louder than words. What are China's objectives? And I think our second speaker started to get to it. Here are some of the things you're seeing coming out of the press from very senior leadership in China. So these are the words that you hear. No freedom of navigation for warships and airplanes. That's a direct challenge to U.S. Vital interests. And you see down here at the bottom even more provocative statements. It's a slap in the face, we will inflict pain if we have to, and those types of statements. So, where does that take us? And so here's the actions speak louder than words. And we've seen timetables. I couldn't put everything up here in one slide, but at the end of the day, you can probably divide what China has been doing into 3 categories over time. Initially, when Mao took over, it's an island reclamation campaign. Sever sovereignty. Take those islands that are historically ours. And then we have an operational pause in the late 1990s and into the 2000s. Focus more on regional integration. Focus on economics. And focus on integrating your own economy with other nations' economies. Massive buildup of their military capabilities, especially their maritime capabilities, their navy, their surface missiles. So during that strategic pause, that's what they're doing. And now we see in 2007, absolutely turning back over to competition. Competition in that environment for sovereignty. Is it about resource control? Is it about enhanced security? Is it about both? I want to come back to this slide here only because it shows a picture we haven't seen before. We talk about the first island chain, the second island chain, the near seas as the Chinese refer to it. I think you can make a strong argument that what China is trying to do now is assert control over the near seas. And they've actually started to discuss, as was pointed out earlier, having a blue water navy that has the capability to assert power elsewhere, out to the second island chain, and wherever they need to. They conducted a Naqabat evacuation op in Yemen. They're talking about a base in Japan. And so they are going to do those types of things. So what I really kind of linger on, this is what I was asked to do, solve the problem here in a few minutes. But as far as the way ahead, I think my argument, and you could argue that it's provocative, I don't think the United States has a cohesive strategy to deal with China as a whole. And the United States Department of Defense just recently released, I don't know if anybody's had a chance to see it yet, an Asia-Pacific Maritime Security Strategy. So there it is in all its glory. But my question is, and it's hard to see here, is the dime fill and these lines of effort to achieve our strategic objectives, is this in alignment with the other aspects of national power? It claims in here that there was discussions between the interagency to come up with it. I'm not so sure that's the case. So where do we go from here? I come back to, before you have a strategy, what are China's objectives? And again, I'll be provocative. I'm with maybe the second speaker. I think China has every intention to assert control and sovereignty over the entire South China and East China Sea. Those bases are going to be militarized. They're going to put anti-submarine warfare, reconnaissance, strike fighter aircraft. They're going to enhance their capability to do reconnaissance, anti-submarine warfare. They're going to make it much more difficult for anybody to enjoy or assert freedom of navigation through those vital areas. I believe that that's what their intention is. So the question is, how do you deal with that? I think Bonnie brought up some good points about how you can potentially work with other nations that have similar interest in freedom of navigation in the area. But I guess what I'm really trying to suggest is we need to have a cohesive whole-of-government effort. We need to re-examine and re-look at what the assumptions are. Hope is not an option. You can't hope that people in China are going to turn around and someday, maybe be back away from things they're doing. It's a great idea, and we should work towards it and try to keep up those exchanges to the extent possible. We're going to continue to do all our military exchanges with the Chinese to try to be transparent, build trust, build relationships, but I don't think it's going to work in the near term at all. And so we need to rethink those assumptions and then come to a conclusion of what is the nature of the relationship we want with China. This is going to be a competitive environment. Get used to it. It's the new normal. So how do we deal with China in that competitive environment in a way that doesn't lead to all-out conflict? And that is really where we're at. Our national interest in freedom of navigation is now butting up against Chinese core interest. And the question then is, how are we going to deal with it? And I come back to this last bullet. Other nations in the region have said, well, the United States is important and China is important. And interestingly enough, our folks at our State Department have suggested they don't intend this to be a zero-sum game. Either choose us or choose them. But and I apologize if I have to put my glass on here. The former foreign minister from Singapore recently said he's not sure if we have the luxury of space as we have in the past to be friendly to everyone. In the next few years, because of competition, they as major powers, as they are wont to do, will soon be talking in terms of either us or them. You're either with us or you're against us. Hopefully it doesn't come down to that, but that is absolutely where certain people think we're going to be. South Koreans are here now to have these discussions. We just talked to the Australians. The Chinese president, the US president will be in Vietnam in November. So we'll see how this plays out. But we come back to, what are these objectives? And this guessing game we're playing with respect to ambiguity, how they react to these FONOS, how they react to this court case about jurisdiction, and how they, deal with the folks in Vietnam, I think are going to tell the tale. And at the end of the day, I think people are fooling themselves if they don't think this is going to be a very competitive environment in the near and midterm. It's going to be the problem we're going to have to deal with. So maybe Governor Webb had it right the other night. I don't know. But anyway, that's hopefully provocative. That's not what I necessarily came to say, but that's what I said. So thanks, John. Thank you, Governor.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Tom.
So I suppose one of the questions is competitive about what? And for what? It's not a ball game here, but interesting. Okay, we don't have an awful lot of time, and we've got 4 or 5 speakers that we want to hear from before we wrap up. So I'm going to ask Elliot Salway, who's been one of our regulars, to come up, talk for just a few minutes.